All right. All right. Party people in the place to be. I go by the name of the BK Apologist, transmitting all the way live. New York is the city, Brooklyn's the borough. What's good? What's popping? Now, there's a saying that, if you're the smartest man in the room, you should leave that room, right? So I'm here to report that I'm definitely going to be staying in the room tonight because we have a bona fide scholar that is in the building. A lot of you have seen him recently on Lisa Fields' program. We've seen him debate, over at Epiphany Church, and this man is just an incredibly gifted orator and teacher. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Vince Bantu. What's going on, Doctor?
Hey, what's going on, my brother Alfredo?
What's going on, sir? It's definitely an honor and a privilege to have you on the show. Now, I know you're a very humble man and don't want to speak about your accolades, so I will speak about them for you. Dr. Bantu holds a MA and PhD in Semitic and Egyptian languages from the Catholic University of America. He also holds an MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary Center for Urban Ministerial Education. He also has a THM from Princeton Theological Seminary, and he has a BA in theology from Wheaton College. His primary interests include theological contextualization, racial reconciliation, early Christianity in Africa and Asia, and theological education in under-resourced communities. He is currently developing a book project with InterVarsity Press exploring multi-ethnic nature of the early church. And him and his wife, Diana, and 2 daughters enjoy traveling, parks, games, and are huge movie fans. In fact, I heard that you are a big Star Wars fan, sir. Is that true?
Oh yeah, man, that's my stuff. I mean, I know I'm not ready to get into this most recent. I'm still in my feelings about it, but in general, I'm still ride or die. That's my stuff.
Yeah, man, it's been rough being a Star Wars fan as of late. I always tell people Star Wars fans are like New York Knicks fans. Like, we support the franchise no matter how bad it gets. So that's just what we are, But yeah, definitely one day we gotta do a deep dive and just nerd out about the last episode. But so let me see. Let me do a quick check-in on the chat. We have Carmel Crunk in the house. We got my man Will M. We got Tyler Lott on the check-in. We got my man Ghost. We got Beatrice Wells. What's going on, sis? We got A-Dog. You know what I mean? So it's filling up really nice. So the way we've got to know each other was via this amazing debate that happened earlier this year with you and Jabari Osase. And it was just a pleasure to be there, just to witness history in the making. And even though today's episode is not primarily about that, but I was wondering, what are a couple of takeaways? What are some life lessons that you've learned from the debate since then?
Yeah, I mean, that was great. And I want to give a shout out to yourself, and then also Pastor Eric Mason and Brother Chris Broussard, but also yourself, man. We were it was a team effort, and I mean it was powerful. How we all kind of went in for the kingdom like that. I mean, I came up in the west side of St. Louis, and I was out in the streets squabbing on the daily, and so the Lord redeemed me from that, and so it was like, I mean, it just felt like kind of like a big old spiritual gang fight. You know what I'm saying? Basically. We had each other's back too, and we was going in too. It's whatever, and like it was an awesome thing, man. It was just great to all be together on that. And I think, man, the thing that really stood out to me too was it just really was encouraging. Brother Jabari, he that's a great brother. I had a great time talking with him before and after the event. And we've even, stayed in contact. So, because one thing that really burdens me is how in our community, it just seems like we're so often not able to really engage a lot of these issues and without it becoming hostile and disrespectful and and just kind of, demeaning and stuff. And so I just think that, of course, as a Christian, as a Nazrawi myself, of course, I want to see everybody come to faith in Jesus Christ. And I want to see people leave falsehoods and leave false religions and come into faith and become followers of Yeshua. But at the same time, even if that's not going to happen, of course, the Spirit has to draw people, and that's between them and the Lord. But I mean, at a minimum, can we just at least as a people, as a community, show respect and have just respectful, graceful dialogue? And we can say, look, I disagree with you. I see it differently. This is how I see it, without getting disrespectful. So it was just very much like, it was just such an encouragement to me to see mainly Nasrawi and Kemetic, but even some Israelite brothers and sisters all in the room, and nothing was tense. And I just want to see more of that. I hope that if nothing else, at a minimum, that can be an example to us so that day to day on the block, when people are out in the streets, or when people are in different things in different hoods across the country, as we interact with each other, be it Israelite, Nasrawi, Christian, Muslim, Kemetic, whatever, that we can start to model similar types of dialogue where we actually learn about one of those beliefs and engage in respectfully. So I think that was just, that really stood out to me. And like you said, we don't want to, I don't know, like be hyping it up too much or anything, but I do kind of like when you said it was historical, I do kind of wonder, is that maybe one of the biggest examples of that kind of, in the Black community in particular, of that level of interfaith dialogue, like I said, in a respectful way. And so hopefully it'll just be an example to our community.
Right. And yeah, that's exactly what I meant by it being a historical event, because it was the first time we had, it was cordial yet vigorous discussion about theological items, and quite often we don't see that. So the fact that you were able to give us that kind of an example was amazing. It created a benchmark for others to follow. So I think that's great. And it's also great that you'll be jumping into the ring shortly, but we'll get into that later. But so what I want to do today, because I know that your wheelhouse is African and Asian Christianity, ancient Christianity. And I heard a couple of your lectures, and I remember you talking about, just Nubian Christianity. Like, if we want to talk about like real, like African, like real melanated Christianity, we got to go to Nubia, right? So that's why I wanted to focus on that today. And there's a particular scripture I want to use as a starting point for that, which is in Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 26. It says, "Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Rise and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert place.' And he rose and went. And there was an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a court official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of all her treasure. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning seated in his chariot, and he was reading the prophet Isaiah." Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, doctor, but when we read about this particular Ethiopian eunuch, it's not the Ethiopia that we think of today, correct? This is a whole different way of seeing it, right? It's not the modern day Ethiopia.
That's exactly right. In the ancient world, I mean, the name Ethiopia is actually a Greek word, and so it's essentially Greek. So the word that Luke used in Acts 8 right there is Ethiopios, right? It's even the modern nation of Ethiopia, which is further south than what was ancient Kush or Nubia or what is now Sudan. The modern nation of Ethiopia actually takes its name from a Greek name. And so just like India, or just like, so many other regions have been, my wife, I think shares a similar ethnic background as yourself. And, the island that is now called Puerto Rico was not originally called Puerto Rico. It was Borinquen. But then when the Spanish came, they renamed it. And so it's kind of a similar dynamic that what is now called Ethiopia, in ancient times, it was called Axum. Well, the capital was Axum. But the kingdom and the people group were known as the Habesha. And so Habesha, even in the Ethiopian language today, is actually the indigenous way. But of course, they've embraced the Western or a Greek term. But Ethiopios, it just means a burnt-faced one or a black-faced person. So it really just means a dark-skinned person. Doesn't even necessarily mean an African person, because you can see other examples in classical literature in Greek where they will say that somebody is Ethiopian, Ethiopios, and they're actually referring to somebody from the Indian subcontinent, or they're referring to someone from South Arabia, or they're referring to someone from actual Ethiopia, or Axum as it was known back then. And in the case of Acts 8, there were many times they're referring to someone from Nubia. In fact, I would say at least in my experience reading ancient texts, when you see the term Ethiopian come up, most often it's referring to a Nubian, because geographically Nubia was closer to the Roman Empire, right, bordered Egypt, which at the time of early Christianity was a part of the Roman Empire. So it was the region of dark-skinned people that was the closest to the Roman Empire than any other region of dark-skinned people like India or Axum or Arabia. And so again, for Luke to say that Philip was on the road to Gaza and he met an Ethiopian, what he really meant, what he was saying was he met a black person. So honestly, I would suggest that Bible translators stop translating it as Ethiopian, because I think that's confusing and misleading. And I think it would actually be a much more accurate translation if Bible translators would just start translating it as Philip met a black person, because that's really what a first century Greek speaking person would have heard when they heard him say he met an Ethiopios. But we can know, furthermore, that this Ethiopios, that this dark-skinned person, this black person, was a Nubian by the fact that it says that he was a eunuch of Candace. And Candace, or Kandake, is actually not a name, but it's actually a title. And it's a Cushitic word, or a Nubian word that means queen. And it was the title of the Nubian queens that were centered at that time in the capital of Merowe on the Nile River in what is now today's Sudan. What then was the region known as Nubia, but the kingdom was called Cush in particular. And the leaders were, and especially the time right before and the time after Jesus, the Nubia was actually ruled predominantly by various queens and Kandakes. And so this person, this eunuch, would have been a very high-ranking official who heard the gospel, and as the word of God tells us, he believed in the gospel, and so essentially this is I'm glad you read that passage, because this is a very pivotal passage, because this is the first black Christian in history that we have a record of, because the Bible mentions Egyptians and Libyans being present at the at Pentecost. So we know there were Africans, but again, like today, North Africans are not considered black by ancient or by modern standards. They're certainly not white, but they are also not black, or as in sub-Saharan African, but they're brown-skinned people. They're our complexion. And so these but back then, unlike, the U.S. has a whole different way of thinking of race. I'm black and white, but in the U.S. I'm considered black. But over there, the Egyptians and the Nubians had a long history of distinguishing themselves as being racially different. So this is by no means the first African Christian, but this is the first example of a black African Christian that we have in Scripture, who was actually, to go back to the question, who was from Nubia.
Right. The people said they were getting some feedback from my mic. I've lowered my mic, guys. Do you still hear the feedback? Let me know in the chat. Are you still hearing the feedback from me? I've lowered my mic. How do I sound? Gotta wait a little bit. Oh, we good? We straight? Nice. So this is the earliest attestation of a Nubian follower of Christ, right? Mm-hmm. So, but it also shows that it's better though. Okay, that's fine. But that also shows that in Nubia there was already at least some sort of community of followers of Yahweh even before, right, Christianity takes effect, right? So that's also very interesting. And he was a very well-to-do, for him to be in charge of the treasury, and the fact that he has his own copy of the scriptures. It's not like today you could just download, a Bible app in seconds and you have it. It's like, so this dude had some bread. This man had some status, right? So that's pretty interesting. So now that is one individual, but what is the earliest date that we have for having an actual community of Christians in Nubia?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because, as you mentioned, this in the Bible itself gives us the witness of the first Nubian Christian. And as you pointed out, this would have been a person who was theologically or by faith a Jew, right? He was visiting Jerusalem during Pentecost, and that he had a scroll of Isaiah, and so he was clearly. And we have evidence of Jewish people in Elephantine, which is right on the border of Egypt and Nubia, and so it's very it's very probable that there were Jews in Meroe and other parts of Nubia as well. And just like in every other direction, in Persia, in Arabia, in Europe, in Egypt, in North Africa, and in India as well, that the gospel, the Bisrat, had originally spread through Jewish communities. And so yeah, that's exactly right. But as you pointed out, that's after that biblical example, it actually there's a gap of time before we start to get more references to other Nubian Christians. And as you said, like a community. Now, again, though, we shouldn't overlook the fact, as you pointed out, this is a high ranking official. He would have gone right back to the capital, Meroe, which was one of the largest and most influential cities in sub-Saharan Black Africa. And so it's very probable to suppose that the Bisrat, the gospel, had spread beyond just this one individual and continued to, be propagated all throughout Nubia, because this is one of the most influential Nubians in the first century. But again, to your question, we don't get actual attestations of more Nasrawi or Christians being present in Nubia until much later. I would say that the earliest time that, first of all, I would mention that Moses the Black is another figure that we should really be knowing about. Now, Moses the Black lived in the 4th century, in the 300s, and he was one of what was known as the Desert Fathers. And really, they should be calling it the Desert Fathers and Mothers, because this is a collection of sayings, of proverbs, and that talk about some of the earliest monks in Egypt. And they lived in an area called the Wadi Natrun, or back then it was known as Skatis. And there was many of them and majority of them were Egyptian. And this is another way we can see the clear distinction between Nubians, Egyptians being brown and Nubians being black, in the sense that even in these sayings, most of them are Egyptian, but Moses, his name is Moses the Black because he's black. And so again, they racially distinguish him from the other Egyptians. And this comes up a lot in the text, and actually in some unfortunately negative ways. And it shows some of the colorism that existed between Egyptians and Nubians as well, and some of the internalized colorism that Moses had about himself. There's a great book by a great New Testament scholar, Gay Byron, called Symbolic Blackness and Ethnic Difference in Early Christianity. And she gets into talking about Moses the Black and some of the ways it reveals how early Roman Christians in particular talked about race. But Moses the Black was another Nubian. Again, he's called the Ethiopios in the Greek literature. And so again, that would have been meant black person, but we can know by the text that he was from Nubia, which bordered Egypt. So he's another Nubian Christian. Now in the 400s, that's when we start to get more indications of Nubian Christians. And one of the biggest examples of that is Shenouda. Now, I've mentioned Shenouda before. He's an early African theologian that we really need to know about. And he is the greatest writer in the history of the Coptic language. And that's the Egyptian language, but during its Nasrawi or its Christian phase. When, from the 300s going forward, most Egyptian literature was Christian or Nasrawi in nature. And Shenouda is the greatest writer of that language in the 400s. And Shenouda, he led a monastery way down in southern Egypt. And he talked about this massive war that happened between different Nubian tribes, some of which were Nubian, and another that was a group called the Blemis. And the Blemis, it's Blemmies. The Blemis are another ethnic group that also show up a lot in this period, and they are often associated with being nomadic people that didn't live in more urbanized civilizations along the Nile like the Nubians did, but they lived more kind of in the desert along the Red Sea, and they had a reputation for often raiding and coming in and fighting against Nubians who lived in the more urbanized centers. And Shenouda in the 400s claimed that there was a massive raid of Blemis where many Nubians were displaced, and Shenouda even claimed that there was 20,000 Nubians that were displaced over this war and escaped from Nubia into Egypt. And Shenouda claims that he housed in his monastery over 20,000 Nubians. And he about in his writings in the Coptic Egyptian language, he talks about how many of those Nubians who took shelter in this Egyptian monastery ended up becoming Nasrawi, becoming Christians. And he talks about how they left their pagan, idolatry and became followers of Yeshua. So, already that's another kind of indicator that the Bisrat, the gospel, was spreading from Egyptians to Nubians. And according to Shenouda, there was thousands of Nubian Christians in the 400s. But the next, and I would say the next, I would share just briefly two more kind of steps in the process of the Christianization of Nubia. The other one that's very well known and prominent, and my friend Salim Farazi's written a book on this, is an inscription by a king Silko, who Silko was the king of Nubia around that same time, actually, as Shenouda was talking about many Nubian becoming Christian. And Silko at the Temple of Kalabsha in Lower Nubia talks about his victory over the Blemmyes. So again, that Blemmyes and Nubian conflict that was going on, Silko claims that he went to war against the Blemmyes and he was victorious over them. And even in this inscription, this is a Nubian inscription, but it's written in Greek because Nubians were international. And so just like in Africa today, people will use English or French as international languages. And so Nubians actually, there's actually more texts and inscriptions that survive in Greek, even more than the actual Nubian language. And so this inscription was another Greek inscription. And when he's celebrating, he writes it on this temple, this pagan temple, and he actually gives victory, or he gives praise to God, theos in Greek. And he says that God gave me the victory. And then Faraji makes this point that theos, or God, is intentionally contrasted in that inscription with idols. He says that he defeats the Blemmyes and that they swore by their idols. So he's contrasting a monotheistic belief of God with the polytheistic belief of the Blemmyes. And so Faraji makes the point, and many other historians as well have understood this to be the indication either of the Bisrat, of the gospel, full stop, or an embrace of it by King Silko of Nubia, or at a very least a progressive indication of Silko and Nubians becoming introduced and becoming to consider Christianity, kind of in a similar way as Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, but there's also very clear signs that he also still practiced traditional Roman religion. So it's more likely that he just kind of was embracing different religions, just syncretizing them and blending them together. And so that may have been what was happening with Silko. But either way, at a very minimum, it indicates that by him referencing a monotheistic God, which would not have been a common thing for a Nubian king to do before that. But Nubians, like Egyptians, were polytheistic, and they believed in a whole pantheon of gods, many of which were very similar to the Egyptian gods, but they also had their own Nubian gods. So, giving thanks to one particular god. But, before, kings like Taharqa or other Nubian kings and queens would have given praise to Amun or to Ra or to, again, a host of gods. But saying theos, that's an indicator that there was some interaction going on with Christianity. And when you couple that evidence from Silko's inscription with Shenouda's report that he was evangelizing and housing Nubians, then we can know that in the 400s, Christianity, the Bisrat, was well underway and was being communicated in Nubia. But the last thing I'll share quickly, and this is the definite kind of beginning of Christianity, or the Bisrat in Nubia, and this comes in the 500s, in the 6th century. And what had happened was, now just to back up in the story just a little bit, at this time in the 500s, the Roman Church or the Roman Empire had made this decision at the Council of Chalcedon that Jesus is one person in two natures. And this was a particular theological decision that was not agreeable to the Egyptian church, Syrian, Arabian, Armenian, and many other, and the Ethiopian church as well, because by this time now, Ethiopia, which was on the other side of Nubia, was also a Christian nation. And so what had happened was in the 500s, the Roman Emperor Justinian he had been severely persecuting the Christians of Egypt and Arabia and Syria, and trying to force the Roman theology into these African and Middle Eastern churches. So this was Christian on Christian violence. It was Roman Christians persecuting Arabian and North African Christians, trying to force their particular theology onto their context. Now, again, it was, in my opinion, it was a silly argument, because the Egyptians and Arabians were saying that Jesus is one person in one nature, and his nature is fully divine and fully human. But the Romans were saying, no, he has a divine nature and a human nature, and they're distinct, but without separation or confusion or mingling, or whatever the Chalcedonian Creed says. Now, in my mind, they were really, and even in many of them today's mind, they really believe the same thing. They all believe Jesus is fully God and fully human. But and we still deal with this today, right? Christians in the dominant culture think everybody's got to do it the way they do it. Otherwise, it's not authentic Christianity. And so this was the beginning of that, only 1,500 years ago. Now, how that affects Nubia is that Justinian, who was the Roman emperor, again, there was an alliance between the king and the Roman church, was going in, and he was trying to enforce one particular belief all over the place. And he had heard that Egyptians were trying to evangelize and that more Christians had becoming in Nubia. So he wanted to send missionaries from the Roman Empire into Nubia, and he wanted to Christianize the Nubian king, but specifically he wanted the Nubian king to become a Chalcedonian Christian, which meant one person, two natures. And again, Egypt was one person, one nature, what was called miaphysite, miaphysis, one nature. And so the Egyptians had heard about this, and it was actually kind of a funny story where Justinian's queen, Theodora, actually was supporting the Egyptians. And so she actually helped them to stall Justinian's missionaries at the border between Egypt and Nubia. And then on the slide, they snuck in some Egyptian missionaries first, and they sent in and went and met the Nubian king. And then this is recorded in John of Ephesus' ecclesiastical history, who was a Syrian bishop who also had the same faith. And it basically says that the Nubian king in the 500s heard the gospel, he believed upon it, and he embraced Christianity as the national religion of Nubia. And it specifically says actually that since we are going to give up and renounce our idolatry and our pagan worship, we don't want to embrace the evil faith of the Romans, but instead we're going to embrace the faith of the Egyptians. So at the beginning of Christianity in Nubia, what you had was you actually had an alliance between this. I just have to point this out because we in our community, we always get these ridiculous claims saying that Christianity was introduced by the Roman Empire. It's a white man's religion, and it was imposed it came from the Romans into the Africans. And I'm like, these people don't read history. Read John of Ephesus' ecclesiastical history. This was a church history text written outside of the dominant Roman Empire in a Syrian language, not even in Greek or Latin. And he talks about this. This is a contemporary text that people can get the story from. But notice what happens at the time. Now, this isn't the beginning of Christianity in Nubia. This is the beginning of Christianity being the state religion of Nubia, because that's already talked about. It was already there from the eunuch in Acts 8. It was there through Silko's inscription. It was there through Shenouda's report of missions and refugees and housing refugees. But at the very beginning of it becoming the national religion, the dynamic was that the Roman Empire was in the midst of trying to impose their particular brand of Christianity. And the Nubian king said, no, thank you, Roman Empire. We don't want your version of Christianity. We want the Egyptian version. So you had Africans uniting with other Africans in protest to the Roman Empire.
Wow. That's crazy. You brought up somebody I was going to bring up later on, King Silko. Now, I have Salim Faraday's book about Silko, and he makes the assertion that Silko was considered the last pharaonic king. Now, would you agree with that claim, or is that maybe reaching a bit?
Well, my understanding of what's meant by that, I think is accurate. That I think what's meant there is that Silko represents, it being in the 400s, in the 5th century, that Silko actually represents the transition of time between the period of, the region that we now call Kush, Nubia, Sudan, it goes through different names, but the 400s was really a time of transition where the kingdom of Meroe, M-E-R-O-E, where the kingdom centered in Meroe, which was known as Kush, was on the decline. And actually a big part of that is actually war with Ethiopia, with Axum, what's now known as Ethiopia. Even in the 300s, that Meroe was on the decline. And by the time of the 400s, there was a lot of transition going on between the kingdom of Kush, which was centered in Meroe, starting to end, and then also the beginning of the area or the region that would be later come to be known as Nubia. Now, when we say Nubia, though, really, that's more of kind of a region. It's almost like saying Eastern Europe or saying like Central Asia. Like these are regions that have various countries in them. And in fact, after the 400s, after the time of Silko, where the pharaonic rule of the Cushite kings, which had been going on for 1,000 years, since the time of Terhaka, who's mentioned in the Old Testament in the 7th century BC, and then going all the way until about the 400s. The kingdom of Cush had been a powerful. Whenever you see the word Ethiopia mentioned in the Old Testament, that's another poor translation. The better translations are the Bibles that say Cush, because that's the name in the Hebrew. That was what it was called, Cush. But the 400s was when Cush was ending, and it was ruled by pharaohs. But so in that sense, it's I think it's appropriate to say the last pharaonic king, because it's at the period of transition between Cush to Nubia. But again, Nubia was actually a confederation or an area of 3 separate kingdoms. And the northernmost one, which was right bordering Egypt, like if you have Egypt up here, the first like kind of Nubian area that you would have would be called Nobatia. And that's where the word Nubia comes from, the Nuba or the Noba, and Nobatia is the region of the Nuba. And the capital there would have been a city called Faras. And then in south of that, you had a kingdom called Makuria. And the capital of Makuria was Dongola. And then further south of that, you had another kingdom called Alodia, and the capital of Alodia was Soba. So you had 3 separate kingdoms, all of which were considered the region of Nubia. And then much later in the 800s, they actually became one kingdom, but it was also not called Nubia. It was called Dotawo. So you got all these different names that were being used, but it just depends on what century you're in. But by the time of the 400s to the 500s, at the time of Christianity's introduction as a state religion, right? Not introduction at all, but as adopted as a national religion, it was also at the same time that Nubia was reinventing itself from the former pharaonic Kushite kingdom that had been there for 1,000 years to now being this kind of confederation of several kingdoms, which were all ruled by their own kings.
Mm. That's amazing, and I bring it up because if that is to be the case, we those in the conscious community would take great umbrage with the fact that their last great pharaoh happened to be a Christian. So I just find that very, humorous that if that is the case. One of the things that I really appreciate what you do is that you bring the different contextualizations of the faith throughout the African continent. You use the word Bizrat and Nasrawi and things of that nature. I was wondering if you could share some of the ways that the Nubian Christians express their belief in Jesus, maybe some of their terms and rituals or cultural things that were embedded within their theology.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, there's not. I would have to say up front that one of the unfortunate defining characteristics of Nubian Bizrat or Christianity is actually kind of a lack of contextualization. But really, unfortunately, is that when you look at Nubian Christianity and you look at the Nasrawis that were operating in the time of Nubia, there's really actually not a lot of contextualization that goes on. I mean, you could look at it from various angles. One, from architecture, because actually material evidence is one of the best ways to really get at and understand, Nubian Christianity. Because they didn't leave a lot of literature behind, especially as compared to North Africa, like where Augustine and Cyprian or Tertullian were from, or Egypt, where you get all this Greek and much Coptic literature, and then Ethiopia, where you get so much literature and theology and commentaries and homilies and translations of the Bible. Nubia actually produced very, very little literature. And so the majority of evidence that you actually get comes from material evidence like architecture and different artifacts. When you look at the architecture of Nubia that was Christian, when you go to Dongola, right, the center capital that really rose to prominence after the time of Soko, and then at the transition of Nubia or Makuria in particular, where Dongola was the capital, that was one of the major trading centers of the African continent. And you're starting in the 500s, going for almost 1,000 years. Now, what happened was when Nubia became a Christian nation, or Christian nations, plural, in the 500s, it remained a Christian nation for 1,000 years. And unfortunately, Christianity died out in Nubia it really started in the 1100s when more and more Muslims started to immigrate into Nubia from the Arabian Peninsula. And then Nubia became slowly Islamified, basically. And the last remnants of Christianity are attested in Nubia in the 1500s. So it was almost 1,000 years. And unfortunately, to this day, the ancient Christianity that was in Nubia is extinct. There are any Nasrawi that you would find among the Nubians today in Sudan, in North Sudan, would be the result of like modern missions. But that ancient church is extinct. And I would argue that a big reason why it is extinct is precisely because it didn't really contextualize like it really should have, in my opinion. And again, when you look at the buildings, like there's monasteries like Casa de Luis, and there's a monastery in Dongola, and Banganarti. There's all these different monasteries that you can see pictures of online, and when you look at them, you see that they are decidedly Roman in their style. That the Nubians, for whatever reason, they just they copied and pasted the Roman style of architecture for their churches as well. And then also when you look at inscriptions, you can see all of these Roman style columns and art and our iconography. Also talking about literature. When you talk about Nubian literature, another example of that is that, like I mentioned, there's very little textual evidence. But even when you do look at the textual evidence, most of it is in Greek. Most of the Christian literature that survives from Nubia during its Christian phase was actually written in Greek. So that even tells you something in and of itself, that they associated, rather than doing theology in their own language, they kind of use the Greek version, which really didn't make a lot of sense, because your average Nubian person did not walk around speaking Greek. I mean, of course, an educated person or a diplomat would, the king probably would, but not your everyday person who's coming into a church or an urpa, the Egyptian word for church. They're not going to really speak Greek. So for them to be writing so much theology in Greek, it really didn't make sense. The second language that they used a lot was Coptic, which was Egyptian language, right? So that's good for the Egyptians. It's good that the Egyptians did theology in Coptic and wrote so much stuff in Coptic. But the Nubians, it seems really clear that they kind of just latched onto the Egyptian or the Greek expressions. When you find stuff actually written in the Nubian language, that actually comes dead last. The amount of literary evidence that remains from Nubia during its Nasrawi period was mainly Greek, then Coptic. Nubian comes dead last. Then when you even look at the amount, and there's a great book by Giovanni Ruffini where he has a collection of actual Nubian manuscripts. But even when you look at the Nubian manuscripts during the Nasrawi period, most of it is just things like, documentary evidence like land sales or, receipts, things like that. There's very little like hymenode or theology that's being done. Most of that is like, is stuff. And the few amount that there is translations. Like there's a Nubian translation of John Chrysostom, who was a Greek theologian in the 300s. There's a Nubian translation of one of his homilies. There's Nubian translations of some Coptic, saint stories. But again, so literarily, they did not really write their own hymenode, their own theology, like the Egyptians and the Ethiopians did, which, mind you, in Egypt and in Ethiopia, the Bisrat survives to this day. The ancient tradition that goes back 2,000 years is still around today. Why? Because they contextualize it where the Nubians really didn't. The last thing I'll mention about an example of that is probably the worst, it's probably the saddest example to see, is that when you see some paintings of Nubia during its Nasrawi period, I think you just see some really sad examples of internalized racism that a lot of the Nubians really had, where they will depict themselves as black because they were black, but they will frequently depict Jesus and Mary and saints or apostles or biblical characters always looking white. And it's just such a stark contrast where they'll have a painting, for example, in a church where they'll have a black Nubian priest or king, and then they'll be being blessed with their hand on them by a white Mary holding a white baby Jesus and some white angels. Now, I mean, you could write that off and say, well, they're in Nubia and they're aware of the fact that against many of our, Israelite, brothers and sisters, they were aware of the fact that Jews were not black, they were not, that majority, especially those from the Levant, those from Israel. Now, of course, as we already said, there were some Hebrews that were in Nubia, not all of them, but there were some. but their mentality was that people from Israel, people from Palestine, were much lighter than they were. And I mean, I get that, but they draw them lily white. and on top of that, it's like, why do you got to make Nubian art love angels? There's angels everywhere. Why do you got to make angels white? Angels could look like anything, and yet every angel you see in a Nubian painting looks white. And there's two paintings I'll mention that just really look really bad. One of them is a painting that was from the cathedral in Faras, which was the capital of Nobatia. This is in the National Museum in Sudan, and the painting is of the harrowing of hell of Jesus when he, before his resurrection, when Jesus descended into hell and freed the captives. That the painting is of Jesus looking white as bright, and then the captives, or the people held captive in hell that he's freeing, are brown skinned. Then the devil, who Jesus has his foot on the devil, and the devil is dark black. And this was done by Nubians. This is Nubians these are black people doing this. And then the other one I mentioned is actually from the monastery in Dongola, where they are depicting the healing of Jesus, who heals the man at the pool of Siloam in the Gospels. And Jesus is white, and the man at the pool of Siloam is black. And so again, most of the time when they draw Israelite or kind of Palestinian people, they look white. But this time they drew a person looking black, as in a person in need of healing, someone who's sick, someone who's lost, someone. Right. They constantly associate Nubians, black people from the 500s, 600s, 700s are constantly associating blackness with depravity and whiteness with that which is holy and things like that. And that's in sharp contrast to Ethiopia, for example. When you look at art from Ethiopia, that is not the case at all. That is not the story at all. That they in their church walls, in their manuscripts that go back 1,000, 1,500 years, everybody looked black. The angels look black. Jesus, Mary, they got afros. Sometimes they look like they got cornrows. Everybody is looking black, and black. They're black and beautiful. The Ethiopians, to a much deeper degree, in architecture and literature and in art, they contextualize the Bisrat. That's an Ethiopian word. They contextualize the Bisrat to their culture. That's why it survived to this day. But the Nubians, they really didn't do that as well. And it's a really sad thing to see. But I mean, I think we see that even today, as we see Nasrawi around the world. We have, Nasrawi in some cultures that own it according to who they are. But sometimes you go to other countries or even other cultures, even right here in the U.S., where you see people in black churches worshiping, and they have a picture of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus on the wall. So you still see examples of people feeling like they have to do Christianity the Western white way. Mm. Just doing it according to their own culture, their language, all those kind of things. So you still see that going on now. And I would say, unfortunately, that really happened in a big way in Nubia.
Wow. You made mention of Islam. Could you speak on the earlier Islamic incursion, and what did the Nubian Christians do when they first came in contact with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that was another major kind of notch, or a major development in the history of the Bisrat among the Nubian people. So as we mentioned before, Nubia was a Christian nation, and a lot of their Christianity, was strongly connected to Egypt. I mean, I didn't mention this, but Egypt, the leader, the Pope, the patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt, he was actually the head of really the African church, because Ethiopia, Nubia, and all of Egypt was all under that same leadership. And so, but the interesting thing is that Egypt was a part of the Roman Empire. It was a colony of the Roman Empire. It wasn't an independent nation anymore, whereas Nubia and Ethiopia were. And so there was an interesting dynamic to where, Nubians and Ethiopians were ecclesiastically connected and under Egypt, but Nubia and Ethiopia were actually independent African kingdoms, whereas Egypt was a colony of Rome. And then when Islam comes around, and then in around 640, the Muslims had conquered Egypt and North Africa. And so now North Africa and Egypt were Muslim colonies. So they went from Roman colonization to Islamic colonization. And of course, the Muslims, the Rashidun Caliphate, also conquered the Persian Empire, and they took much of the Eastern Roman Empire, including Egypt and North Africa, as well as Syria and Arabia, and much of like modern Turkey. And they conquered almost pretty much everywhere they went. But the one place in the 600s that Muslims attempted to conquer where they failed was Nubia. And so Nubia, after they conquered Egypt, the Muslims went to war with Nubia. And there was a massive war that the Nubians won. And so again, this is to a lot of our black Muslim brothers and sisters, where they'll say that, Islam is the religion of the black man. It's like, well, actually, the Bisrat, when it entered into Africa with Egyptians, Libyans, Nubians, and Ethiopians, it was all free. Nobody ever forced Egyptians, North Africans, Libyans, Nubians, Ethiopians. Nobody forced them to become Nasrawi. They freely embraced it. Islam, on the other hand, the first time it set foot on African soil, it was with a sword and it was with force. And the Muslims conquered Egypt with force. They conquered North Africa with force, which, by the way, were mostly Christians, right? So at the time Islam came into Africa, most Africans were Nasrawi in all these areas. So the Bisrat has been in Africa much longer, and it was freely embraced, right? And not only that, but even after they conquered Egypt, what you had was a war going on between Arab Muslims who were trying to fight against black Nubian Christians. So it was really the first Christian-Muslim war, even long before any other one, and it was between Arabs and black Christians, and the Nubians won. And even Arab historians like Ibn Khaldun and al-Makrizi will talk about this in their historical records and talk about how the Nubians were too good with the bow and arrow. They had this reputation as being pupil smiters. And this is a reputation that Nubians had going back to Pharaonic Egypt and Pharaonic Kush. One of the most famous artistic depictions of Nubians is from like the 1500 BC. These little Nubian statues that are at the kingdom of at the museum of Aswan, museum in Aswan, of these figurines that are like 3,000 years old of black, dark-skinned Nubians, which the Egyptians themselves depicted as racially different than them. But also they draw them with bow and arrows, and there's this reputation of Nubians being these expert archers. That goes back to like Pharaonic days. But yeah, the Nubians won. There was even Arab historians talk about this history. They even say that there was a Nubian soldier who went up to an Arab soldier who said, "Where do you want me to put my arrow in you?" And he put it exactly there because they were so good with it. And so yeah, what happened was the Nubians won, so they kept Islam out of Nubia. And what happened was the Arabs who now conquered Egypt. Now Egypt was still predominantly Nasrawi as well, but it was under Muslim control. The Muslims were in control of Egypt, but the population was majority Nasrawi. It was mostly Christian. But so what had happened was the Arabs who had conquered Egypt created a peace treaty with the Nubians that was known as the Pact, the BAQT. And the Pact treaty stipulated that Nubians would send slaves to the Arabs. And so this was actually, unfortunately, the beginning of the African slave trade, because people always talk about European slave trade that started in the 1400s, but we often forget that, the Arabs were trading African slaves well before, and the trans-Saharan slave trade that was exporting slaves from East Africa, like in Zanzibar and other places, that was really kicking off in the 10, 11, 1200s, sending slaves over into the Arabian Peninsula, into Persia, into India, even into China. That was going on for hundreds of years, well before white folks ever showed up and tried to get in on it. And so that actually began, unfortunately, with Nubians who decided with this peace treaty to send slaves into Egypt, and which would then go out into other parts of the Islamic world. And then for the other side of the trade, Egypt, which was now ruled by Muslims, would send grain into Nubia. And they had this peace treaty that would go on every year because Egypt was the biggest, supplier of grain in the ancient world. And that's why the Roman Empire was trying so hard to control them, because it was an important resource. So they traded this. And then part of the stipulation also was that Nubians would remain under Christian control, and Egypt would remain under Islamic control. And that pact lasted for hundreds of years.
Wow. So with all this knowledge that you've obtained throughout your studies about ancient Christianity and looking at the modern church today, what are some things that we now, right? What are some things that we can glean from these African ancestors about how they did their Christianity? Like, what are some things that we could take from them that we should implement today in our individual congregations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm so sorry, brother. Can you hold on just one quick second?
Sure.
I'll be right back.
Sure. So what's going on, everybody? I see we got TKC in the building. We got Sister Lala in the building. Was good. Hope you guys definitely appreciate what's going down. Dr. Bantu is definitely spitting them gems for us right now. And I mean, this is just all off the head. You know what I mean? Like, this is not even stuff that he prepared. Like, this is what he does, obviously. You know what I mean? So, and I know a few of you might have some questions for the good doctor. So after we wrap this last question, I'm going to see if he'll take a couple of questions from you guys. So really think of some really good questions to ask Dr. Bantu when he comes back, which he is here right now.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah.
So so what are some things that we can use today from our ancient Christian brothers in Africa?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one thing that I wanted to mention, and I've shown this many times before, it's actually going to be on the cover of my new book, The Multitude of All Peoples, with InterVarsity Press. But there's this painting that's from Dongola. This is, a helpful kind of contrast to the picture that I was painting of Nubia, where, like I said, for the most part, they really didn't contextualize the Bisrat. But there's actually one really powerful image that I really want to actually study some more and really get into as my next research project. But there's an image in the monastery at Dongola, which was, again, the capital of Makuria, the central kingdom of Nubia. And it has a nativity painting of Mary and Jesus. And to the right, you have shepherds. And then up top, you have angels, like you see in a typical nativity scene. But on the other side, you see these Africans who are clearly not Nubians, but they were Central Africans from the Bambara tribe, and which from modern day near like kind of southwestern Chad and northeastern Cameroon. And so this this painting was done around the year 1000, and so that painting really, it has these Africans with sticks and drums, and some of them are wearing animal masks, which is very characteristic of many sub-Saharan African tribes. So these are clearly not Nubians. The clothing and the style of music and masks that they're wearing clearly indicate that they are outside of Nubia. And so this is I think one of the strongest indicators of the fact that the Bisrat was traveling. It went from Egypt to Nubia to Ethiopia, and it was traveling further on. And so, and the sad thing is that it was really the fault mainly of the European church for trying to lay hold of the gospel and try to claim ownership of it, that really halted and stopped and handicapped the kingdom work that was happening on the African continent for many years. And so unfortunately the further extremities, the shores of West and South Africa, unfortunately, it was a polluted perversion of Christianity that arrived in the 1400s going forward, when people first heard the name Jesus through people who claimed to be following and clearly were not. And so now we have to untangle and disentangle this, Eurocentric, white supremacist, colonial Christianity that we've heard, and now go and connect back to these expressions of Christianity that were on their way to us, on our way to our ancestors in the other parts of the continent. This painting really shows, it gives us one of the strongest windows of how that Bisrat was traveling across the African continent. And so I think that's something that we just need to really take a lot of encouragement from, that while there is now 500 years of very bad history that we do need to acknowledge, and we do need to unpack that and really try to decolonize a lot of our Hymenot or our theology. That at the same time, that was not the beginning of the story in Africa among Black people, and that the Bisrat was present in all of these different contexts, and it was even going further out, as this painting shows us. And I think the other thing, well, the quick thing, I'll just close it out with so we can get to the questions. But the biggest thing I would say that we take from it is not only that was the Bisrat present, but also we actually can learn from the Nubian church. And we can look at the ways in which, again, as I'm saying, the fact that it was so not contextualized and that it was so, Europeanized, I think we should take that as a cautionary tale, and we should take that as a lesson to show us that it's very important for us as people of African and indigenous descent here today, who are Nazrawi, who are followers of Yeshua. We have to take this very seriously, because this is exactly why so many people are, I'm not condoning or agreeing with a lot of these movements, but part of the reason that some of these people are leaving the church today is because the degrees to which, unfortunately, so much of Christianity is still complicit with white supremacy and the oppression of Black and brown people. And so I think for those of us who are followers of Yeshua, we have to learn from that. we have to really contextualize the Bisrat and to really decolonize and our hymenot, our theology, and our worship, our ministry, our how we practice and how we worship Yeshua. It has to look Afrocentric, and it has to look contextual to Black and brown context, not to the idolatry of those cultures, not to those cultures take precedent before our identity in Christ, but it's exactly for the glorification of Christ, because God made us this way on purpose, not so we can ignore it or not all do it one particular way. And so I think when we compare Nubia to Ethiopia or to Egypt, we can see, we can see so many all the stuff I was saying about Nubia and the ways that they didn't contextualize the Bisrat. In Ethiopia and Egypt, they did the exact opposite. They did contextualize it in the exact opposite ways. And again, as I mentioned, notice how in those contexts, that ancient church tradition still survives to this day. And so I think that to me is the greatest lesson we can learn, that just in the same way that they contextualize it, we have to, I think, we'll reach back and connect to those ancient African traditions. But then also we need to, reach back, connect to it, and then contextualize it and figure out what that means for us in St. Louis, in Brooklyn, in Houston, in different hoods that we're around too. That what does that look like for us to follow Yeshua as he made us?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we definitely have to shake off the cultural imperialism that's been inflicted upon us. It's funny. I feel like the Europeans, I don't think they understand that the gospel was contextualized for them, right? These Semitic believers, when they started reaching out to the Roman Empire, they spoke in a manner in which they would understand, right? When Paul's talking to the Stoic philosophers, he says, some of your own poets have said, we are God's offspring. So they took it as, well, this is the way to express it. It's like, no, we're expressing it this way for you so that you can get it. But they turned around and decided that, well, this is the standard by which you express the faith. That's why you had the issue with the church in Alexandria about the God, Christ's deity. How in Africa it sounded like they were talking about two Jesuses, right?
Right.
So, but that's an issue of cultural imperialism. They were both saying the same thing, but because you're not expressing it in my way. You're not doing it in my style. Now we have a problem when we shouldn't have, right? So definitely, that was a great build. The doctor will take a couple of questions here real quick, and I see one right off the bat. Let me see here. My man, Theosis says, any idea when Dr. Bantu's book "Multitude for All Peoples" will be made available on Amazon?
Oh yeah, thank you, brother. So it actually is on pre-order on Amazon now, and
Nice.
and I would say, definitely. The publisher, InterVarsity Press, told me, that it should be out this like springtime, like March or April. So definitely, please keep your eye out for that. This spring it should definitely finally be out in print.
That's what's up. Be prepared for people to critique the book, Doctor. And you know who I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
So get ready for that. All right. Here's another question from Carmel. Is Vince Bantu familiar with Deuteronomy 32 worldview? I don't know if you understand what she means by that.
No, I'm not. I don't know if. I'm familiar with the kind of the way that a lot of Israelite brothers and sisters view Deuteronomy 28.
Right. No, that's not what she means. That's we're definitely big fans of like the work of Michael Heiser and the whole idea of the divine council. So she's speaking about in that manner, So I don't know if you're familiar with Heiser's work. No? Okay.
No.
That's fine.
Yeah, I love to learn though.
No, Heiser's dope. You definitely got to look into some Heiser. He's definitely dope. Any other questions, guys? Any other questions? If not, what are some up and coming things that's headed down your way, Dr. Bantu? Well, I know one thing. Let me share it right off the bat. Hold on. Let me see. Let me find this real quick. Let me share my screen. Yeah, this is pretty major when I found out about this. Yes, sir. Let's talk about this.
Yeah.
Let me make this bigger. Hold up. Yep. We have another debate going down, party people. It's called Double Impact NYC. It's a double
Maybe
header.
think
We
that
got
Jean-Claude Van Damme movie from back in
right. We got Brother Garfield versus Jabari Osase, and they'll be debating on was Christianity stolen from ancient Kemet. I think it's interesting that these particular individuals are debating that topic, but I'll leave it at that. And of course, you, sir, will be debating Captain Tazariak, and the two topics is Christianity good for our people, and is Christianity the white man's religion? It's going down March 22nd, St. Francis College, 180 Ramsden Street, Brooklyn, right by me. I'm like 20 minutes away from there, bro. So I will definitely be in the building for that.
You rolling with me, dog?
Oh, I'm with you, bro. I'm so with you. Yeah, because it's hostile territory. You know what I mean? Because it's not in the church, right? It's gonna be,
it's Act 17 type of territory,
basically. And people are aware of what happened at the previous debate, and people want some get back. They want some get back, bro. I'm just gonna let you know right now. So I know you're up for it. You know what I mean? You're definitely a warrior. So it's gonna be dope. Okay, we got a couple of questions here. Here's one. What is the best way to minister to Black Hebrew Israelites and bring them into Christianity? That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. One-on-one. not toe-to-toe when they got their loudspeaker and they on and got all these signs and charts and they getting all hyped up and everything. That ain't, that's just a bunch of talking loud and saying nothing, as the king said. No, I would say, yeah, like when you talk to them one-on-one, it's a different story. Like, and you really, ask them some hard questions and help them to really reconsider. But one thing, I have I share this a lot. I have a 3-part strategy with not just Hebrew Israelites, but just with a lot of these groups in general. And I think that number one, it is that we have to be militant. And I know a lot of my Nasrawi brothers and sisters will even kind of get cautious about that. But again, I'm talking about in a Bisrat oriented way. I'm not talking about in a fleshly, worldly, idolatrous type way. But I'm talking about, look, Jesus does not like injustice. He does not like mass incarceration. He does not like redlining. He does not like predatory lending. He does not like the ways in which so many of our Black and brown communities are being oppressed. And I think that we as Nasrawi have to be very, very prophetic about how we address injustice, because a lot of these groups, they already know that we're just going to give them just pray, it'll be better in the afterlife, or and this and that. We have to speak out against injustice. I think we have to present the Bisrat in a much more Jeremiah, Isaiah, Micah, Jesus, turning tables over kind of way. And we have to show people in our community that the church, the URPA, cares about justice, and we're not just trying to look the other way about that. They're going into these communities because they're speaking to the injustice they go through. So I think that's number one, is we have to show them that we are deeply passionate, and of course in love and grace and in a Christ-like manner, but we have to speak out against injustice. And to let people know, to tear those walls down. Number two, I think we have to go to history. And then, because after we've done that, I think once we've shown them that we are passionately concerned about injustice and we prophetically denounce injustice, then we win trust. But then people are like, yeah, but I still can't get down with that Christianity stuff because it comes from this. But now that we've already built that trust, number one, then number two, we can go to history and we can start sharing all this different things about Ethiopia and Egypt and the Nubians fighting off and all that kind of stuff. We can recorrect their history, right? And say, well, actually, the history you've been told is not complete, and let's go to some sources, these primary sources we're talking about. And then that leads them into number three, which is let's take them to the Shaja, The shaja is the Egyptian word that I like to use to refer to the Bible, as it's known, by its Western title. But we take them to the shaja umpanuda, the word of God. Shaja umpanuda in Egyptian is the word of God. And that's what we take them to. And of course, that's the most important one. That's the most valuable one, right? But unfortunately, based on where a lot of people are at, we can't start with the shaja. We actually have to kind of get their lab. We have to just meet them where they're at first. And that would be that's always my 3-step process. Is number one, let's be militant in a Christ-like militancy. Number 2, correct history. And number 3, take them to the shaja umpanuda.
Right. And I'm really glad you share that, because a lot of times people think that urban apologetics is just about having this persuasive argument and that's it. It's like, no, these arguments are meant to take away the obstacles that block people from the gospel, right? Because the end game is the gospel. But, I can't share the Bible with someone who thinks that the Bible's been plagiarized from another ancient source. That's right. I can't talk about Jesus if they believe that the man didn't even exist in the first place, right? So apologetics has its place, but it's not salvific in that manner. It's a great tool that we need to have to get to what really matters, which is the gospel. So I definitely appreciate that. I have a question from one of your students, Beatrice Wells.
Hey, Beatrice.
Yes. It says, can Dr. Bantu expound on how America's hymenaut, is that how you say it? Hymenaut?
Yeah, hymenaut.
Hymenaut is tied to the Conservative Party, and how can we get away from that? She's starting trouble.
Yeah. Hey, that's what I'm talking about, though. That's we got to talk about it, right? We got to talk about it. Because that's what I said at the debate. But I have no problem, and I think we have to have no problem about like throwing a lot of our dominant culture people under the bus and being like, look, I don't mess with them. Like I shared like that famous quote from Frederick Douglass when he said, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I will recognize the widest possible difference. And to love one means to hate the other. And I think that, when we got 80% of white evangelicals who put this fool in office that we got, we have to understand, we have to talk about how the hymenaut of America, I don't even want to call it hymenaut, the theology, right? The doctrine. I don't have to turn on this nonsense, right? But I think that's a great question, right? Because when you look historically, the conservative, politically and theologically, people are always the ones that are always, for the last 200 years, trying to protect the rights of the majority and deny the rights of the minority, whatever, even if it was Republican or Democrat before or now, right? But we have to look at that. When people present, and I'm not trying to tell people who to vote for, not at all. But I think that theology or hymenaut can be political without being partisan. And I think there's a difference there. And I think that all that to say that, we do need to care about the sanctity of all life. And we do need to be concerned about the unborn. In my person, I put my cards on the table. I do believe in marriage between a man and a woman. But those cannot be the only issues that we think about when we think about how we apply our faith, our hymenaut in Yeshua, when we apply that to how we engage publicly, right? And that things have been, because the Shaja, the Bible, also has a whole lot to say about how to treat strangers and foreigners. And it has a whole lot to say about how we treat the poor. And it has a whole lot to say about liberating the oppressed and the captives. And what does that mean? What does it mean for us to believe in a Shaja, a Bible, a word of God that talks about setting the captives free when we live in a country that has more prisoners and more prisons privately held than every other country combined? What does that? So again, I'm not trying to tell people how to vote, but I'm saying we have to think more than just two particular social hot button issues. The last thing I'll say about this, and there's a really great book I would recommend called The Great Reversal by what is his name? I'm blanking on the author's name at the moment, but the book is called The Great Reversal, and it talks about it's really great. It's a really great text, and actually Beatrice will be doing this at Meacham too. Beatrice representing that Meacham School of Hymenaut up in here. This in our Ubuntu class, right, which is our theology of justice. And we get into this great reversal, this historical kind of divide in white American Christianity that separated justice from truth. And, like on the one hand, I mean, goes back to the Scopes trial and the battle for Princeton, my alma mater. And, right there in New York City, right, what's that, Riverside Church, Harry Fosdick, they talk about the fundamentalists and the liberals and all that kind of stuff. You had in white Christianity, you had this division between, truth and justice. And you had liberal Christianity emphasizing justice and human flourishing. And then you had the conservative side emphasizing truth and doctrine and orthodoxy. And the more one went the other direction, the more the other went the other one. And so even to this day, you have denominations that Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Lutheran, that have split. You have liberal and conservative Methodists, liberal and conservative Baptists, liberal and conservative Lutherans and Presbyterians, and so on and so forth. One that emphasized justice and one that emphasized truth. The beautiful thing, though, about the Black church tradition is that there is no such division. You can't, there's a holistic, unified understanding that we have to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love our neighbor, because the first command is like the second command. You can't do one without the other, right? And that's why even to this day, the Black church is still hands down the most valuable and the most prominent institution in the Black community, and is doing more for Black folks than any cult or any sect or any new religious movement or any government agency. The Black church is still the thing that families in our community go to, right? And I think that is a holistic bisrat, a holistic vision of the gospel that I think would really help to correct this really kind of binary that American theology has really kind of divided itself into.
Well said, man. Totally agree with that. Here's another question here. Is there a book on the primary sources of North African church fathers? Any recommendations, Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would give a quick plug that I actually created a I'm almost positive that it's still there, but I created a bibliography for early African Christianity that is available on the Jude 3 Project website. And so you can definitely check that out. Also, this is just a plug. I mean, this is a bit further off, but I actually just signed a contract with University of California Press to do another book that will really kind of be a follow-up book to the one that's coming out. The one that's coming out is something that I've written. It's a secondary text that hopefully can give an introduction to the early Bisrat in Africa, Middle East, and Asia, so that people can get some orientation and know who the people are, what happened, this and that. But one thing that a lot of people ask me when I share a lot of these names and a lot of these sources is that people will want to read them. And this is in and of itself, I would say, an example of white supremacy and racism and problems, is the fact that Western church history is so accessible. You can go and you can read John Calvin, Martin Luther, Thomas Aquinas, Jonathan Edwards, Augustine, John Chrysostom. You can read all that stuff easily online. But when I start talking about Ethiopian and Syrian and Indian and Chinese sources, like Zara Yacob and Georgius of Sagla and Narsai and Afrahat and all of these other theologians that people don't ever even talk, even other people with PhDs in church history don't know who these people are, because we only know about the Western stuff. When I introduce it, people say, okay, Vince, then how can I read these cats? And then that's when I got hit with the reality, like, man, you really can't unless you speak these ancient language or read these ancient languages. Or, if you get lucky that one of them's translated in German, French, or Italian or something, maybe some of them are English, but they're in these really these inaccessible academic publications. They're not as accessible as the Western stuff. So the Lord put it on my heart. And I thank God that we have a contract now that I'm co-editing a book that assembles 12 different authors. We're looking at 12 different early African, Asian, and Christian languages where the Bisrat was spreading, and people did Hymenot theology in these different languages: Chinese, Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopian, Egyptian, Coptic, all Syrian, all these different languages. And they're going to be an English translation, and it's going to be like kind of the most prominent theologians in these different countries, all pre-colonial, all pre-15th century, to show that. And so that's going to be keep an eye out for that. To be looking for that. But for now, what I would say, the best things that are out there would be Shenouda is who I mentioned, who is the greatest writer in the history of the Coptic language. They're a little pricey, but there are some English translations of his writings that have been done recently. The Selected Discourses of Shenouda, and also the Canons of Our Fathers. Also, I would recommend the writings of Ephraim the Syrian. Ephraim the Syrian is a 4th century theologian who wrote in the Syriac language, and a lot of his writings have been translated into English as well. His hymns on faith and also his hymns on paradise, his hymns on nativity, and a lot of those actually are, if you look on Amazon, for a lot of his writings, they are a lot more affordable. They're not as pricey, and so some of those have been done in English that I would highly recommend. And I'm sorry, but you asked about North Africa. Again, I like those other ones better because again, they're not Latin, and also they're in a much more culturally contextualized kind of way. But you did ask about North African, and so of course Tertullian. There's a whole website. You can go to tertullian.org and read everything he ever wrote, almost in English translation. The Passion of Perpetual Felicity, the writings of Cyprian, his treatise on the unity of the church, and also, of course, Augustine, who, his Confessions, his City of God, his De Trinitate, all these different kind of texts that they all wrote in Latin, and those are, of course, available in English as well.
Cool. Here's the next question. What strategies can we implement to reach our people in the streets and in jail and bring them into the body of Christ?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think that as I said, I just want to reiterate again, kind of the 3 steps that I usually recommend to people when you approach people, and I think that this is even more important on lockdown. And I got to give a shout out to one of my old employers, New York Theological Seminary, right there, that has a program in Sing Sing prisons, one of the only full seminary programs for inmates in a correctional institution. And I was privileged to teach with that program, and it's still a program that's still running, and it's amazing. But I think that, and when I taught a class in Sing Sing, there were 0 Christians in the whole class. and I was teaching the class on the Old Testament. And so, but we were getting into, I kept on changing the subject and getting in all this church history stuff because that's more my wheelhouse. But also, we had everything: 5%ers, Kemetic, Muslim, Santeria. We had everything but Christian up in that audience, right? Because we know in lockdown, this is one of the main areas where a lot of people get introduced to this kind of stuff, right? And so but whether it's in lockdown or on the block, I think that we have to hit them again with, helping them to see a Christocentric militantness, right? A prophetic activism, right? That is Christocentric. That let them see that we are deeply concerned and actively engaging the injustices that are in our community. We have to, I would say it is on us. We have earned a bad reputation, even as Black or Hispanic Christians, right? We just celebrated Dr. King, right? But Carrie Day points this out in her book, Unfinished Business, that we want to sanitize and romanticize the civil rights movement and the civil rights era. But she points out that when we look at it, only 13% of Black churches were actively involved in the civil rights movement when it was going down. Now everybody wants to act like they were all down with it after the fact and name the holiday after the brother, but nobody was feeling Dr. King in his day. Nobody was feeling the kind of work that the Civil Rights Act, they were considered rabble rousers and troublemakers, and people need to calm down. And it wasn't just white Christians saying that, Black Christians were too, or not getting involved. So we have to get involved. Again, we have mass incarceration, police brutality, all these other kind of issues in our community, redlining. We have to prophetically reclaim that voice that the Black church has. And then, number 2, I think when we've earned that trust back in our community as Black and Latino churches, when we earn that trust back by showing them we care about the injustice that we're facing, that they're facing, then I think that we have to correct their understanding of history that's been skewed, right? And then that can lead us into sharing the Shaja, sharing the word of God, now that we can open up the door to trusting it once again by correcting that history and also speaking to the injustices that they're going through.
Yeah, that was powerful. That's definitely powerful. What are the doctor's social media? I want to keep up and support this man. How can we reach you, doctor?
Oh yeah, man. Thank you, brother. Yeah, you can definitely hit me up. I would say, I teach at Fuller Seminary here in Houston, Texas. You can see me on the website there. Also, I run a seminary program that is aimed at equipping, especially ethnic minority leaders in the church with theological education. The Meacham School of Hymenot, and you can see the website there is www.meacham.org, www.meacham.org. you can check out our website. You can support us on there. We take all kinds of support and gifts. None is too big or small. And you can definitely hit me up on there. You can hit me on Facebook, Vince Bantu, and Twitter as well. Just as a little plug too, for some events coming up through the Meacham School. Number one is actually in October, we will be having a conference, a Hymenote conference from an Afrocentric perspective on biblical studies and church history and practical apologetics, preaching. We will be having a conference. It's called the Society of Gospel Hymenote, and it will be held at Urban Ministries International on October 23rd and 24th. It will be convening Black scholars, students, professors, but we want anybody to come, whether somebody's officially in school or not, whatever. But we're going to get down and it's going to be a conference where we revision and reimagine and really bring the Black church tradition into theological discourse and context, and really try to recenter Black theology or Hymenote, but in a more biblical context. So that'll be at Urban Ministries International, Chicago, October 23rd and 24th. Definitely please come out and hit us up on that. The link for that is on the invitation for that is on my Facebook, but it's also on the Meacham website. And then the last thing I'll plug real quick is that some of these places we're talking about, we are going to go to this. So in January of 2021, during the festival of Timket. Timket is the biggest holiday in Ethiopia. It's the Feast of the Epiphany, right? The baptism of Jesus. That's going on right now, actually. A year from now, the Meacham School of Hymenote will be taking a group of people to Ethiopia for a 10-day tour, and we will see ancient churches that are 1,000 and 1,500 and 1,700 years old, way before colonialism. We're going to see the best examples, I would say, of pre-colonial, early African Bisrat Christianity. So definitely be on the lookout for that. We're going to be posting details about that very soon, like in the next week or two. But that's January 2021.
That's super dope. One last question. Dr. Bantu, is that program available online?
Yes, that program is fully available online. So we offer, and actually to my people in the tri-state area, this is hot off the press, but the Meacham School of Hymenote offers intensive classes that cater to people who are bivocational, who are working, and we offer intensive classes that are in 1 week or in a couple weekends. Right now, our first cohort has been operating in St. Louis, where students can go there and study in residence, but also our degrees are fully available online as well. People can stream in online and do it right from the comfort of their home, wherever they're at. We also have partnerships with accredited seminaries so that our courses, which are only $300 for an entire 3 credit hour course, which is on the master's level, all taught by African-American PhDs in biblical and theological studies, are all also through our partnerships. You can get a full Master of Divinity or a Master of Arts in theology through our programs at 20% of the cost of a typical seminary degree in a contextual format, fully available online. But also, I want to give a shout out to my people in the tri-state area that actually we are launching our tri-state area cohort. We've had our first one in St. Louis, but we will be launching a cohort that'll be based at a church in Newark, New Jersey. I'll be coming out there to teach a class in African church history, April 1st through the 4th. And so again, if you are interested in taking that class in person or online in either of our sites, St. Louis or Newark is starting up again just this spring, but you can come and take the class with us in person or stream online, and you can get your entire degree online fully or in person at 20% of the cost.
Wow, that's amazing, man. Thank you so much. Dr. Bantu, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for just spitting them rapid fire gems. You know, I'm sure this video will get a lot of replay value. People are going to do a lot of play and pause to get those little insights that you gave us. Any last words you would like to say to the people before we sign off?
Yeah, man. I just, I'm glad you opened up with scripture. Maybe we can close with it. You opened up talking about Acts chapter 8. And we've been talking today about Nubian Christianity. And there's a famous verse in Psalm 68 that I think is really appropriate to close with, where it talks about that Cush or Nubia will stretch out her hands to God. In verse 31, it says, envoys will come from Egypt. And this is talking about, that great day where all nations, that God reveals his Bisrat, his salvation through Israel, but that all nations will come to God and will sing to God. You kingdoms of the earth, sing praise to the Lord. It shows really just how God, or Nuda in Egyptian, Nuda has called all people to himself through his son Yeshua, and that every nation will come and bow before him. But specifically to lift up Nubia, as we have today in verse 31, it says envoys will come from Egypt, and it says Cush, or Nubia, will submit herself to God. And that was in Psalm 68. And we already saw, when Luke showed that eunuch becoming saved in Acts chapter 8, that prophecy was fulfilled. And even in Acts 1, it said from Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And from an Israeli context, Nubia was the ends of the earth. And so already we see that being fulfilled in scripture, that Nuda, the creator, Yeshua's plan of salvation, has in mind specifically Black people, Nubian people. And most of us in the diaspora, we are of Nubian descent. And so, and we are of, most African people emerged from Nubia, Ethiopia, these Nile Valley civilizations. So really this passage really speaks, we are the evidence. We black people who are sons and daughters of the King, who are followers of Yeshua, we are that eunuch in Acts 8 is not the only fulfillment of this prophecy, but we are the fulfillment of this prophecy. We are the Nubians, so to speak, who are stretching out our hands in worship and praise to the only King, our Lord and Savior, Yeshua HaMashiach. And so I just want to encourage everybody out there to continue to live out this prophecy as proud Black followers who are saved and sanctified by the blood of Yeshua.
Amen, bro. Definitely appreciate your time. This is the BK Apologist, so we're going to be signing off. Catch you on the flip side. Peace.
Peace.